Greiner Talks, about sustainability and transformation. A Greiner podcast episode.
Here comes a very special edition of Greiner Talks. This episode is all about climate change. How can trees help save our planet? And how can each and every one of us make a difference? My guest today is Felix Finkbeiner, the 23-year-old founder of the organization Plant for the Planet. And if technology allows, I am now, from the Greiner headquarters in Austria, connected to Felix, who is currently on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Good morning, Felix. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm very good. Thank you.
Thanks for taking your time, and sorry for kicking you out of bed at 6 a.m.
Don't worry about it.
Felix, just before our call, I zoomed in on Google Maps to find out where exactly you are located. And it is a very tiny village called Constitucion in southeastern Mexico, not far from Belize and Guatemala. So can you give us a small impression of what your surroundings look like at the moment?
Yeah, so this is an area that used to have vast tropical rainforest. Unfortunately, a lot of this rainforest was destroyed in recent decades. And this is why we of Plant for the Planet are here with a team of about 100 employees to restore as much as possible of that rainforest. And our headquarters of our work here in Plant for the Planet Mexico is in the small village of Constitucion. This is a village of about 1,000 people. And we've got a few little houses here that we live and work in. And every morning at 6:30 a.m. Work starts here, very simply because we spend most of our day working in the field and gets very hot at noon. That's why everyone likes to start work very early, just at the crack of dawn. And then our workday ends before 3 p.m. When it's just unbearably hot.
That sounds very different from my office here in Austria, and it sounds like it's a little warmer for you in Mexico, because here it's quite windy, rainy, and it has around 6 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, we've got over 30 degrees every day here, which I do really enjoy, but it does get a little hot at times.
We're not here to talk about weather, but we are here to talk about climate. So actually not that far off topic. Felix, at the age of 9, you have founded Plant for the Planet. That was 13 years ago. Today, your organization has more than 100,000 members and you're operating in several countries around the world. You support the goal to plant 1 trillion trees. That's an incredible number. But let's go one step back. How did all of that start?
Well, it started 13 years ago. As you mentioned, I was 9 years old back then, and my teacher asked me to give a little presentation in my class about the climate crisis. And when I prepared that presentation, I found out about Wangari Maathai, a woman from Kenya who had launched a movement that ended up planting 30 million trees in 30 years. And that inspired me that we kids should also be planting trees. So I told my classmates that we should plant 1 million trees in each country of the world. And lots of my classmates thought that that was a great idea. And this is why a few weeks later, we planted our first tree. And this is really where we were very lucky, because 2 local journalists reported about that tree. And that's how some other schools found out about it and started planting some trees as well. And Plant for the Planet grew from there, with a slightly older student creating a very simple website for us, which was essentially just a ranking among local schools of who had planted the most trees. And lots of schools wanted to outcompete their neighboring schools, and this is how Plant for the Planet spread. After 1 year, we had planted about 50,000 trees. After 3 years, the first million. Children all around the world started joining us.
This journey has started 13 years ago in Germany. Now you are in a totally different part of the world. How did that happen? What are you doing in Mexico right now?
So this really began in 2013, back then, we had a little project with the local government here and realized that the survival rates of some of the trees that were being planted here were incredibly low. And we wanted to show that it's possible to plant trees more effectively and more efficiently. So we started developing our team here and took charge of about 20,000 hectares. That's about the size of the country of Liechtenstein. And since then, 2013, we've been slowly improving and getting better at restoring this forest. And we are now restoring at a rate of almost 3 million trees planted a year.
I'm curious to know, why did you choose to plant trees in Mexico right now? Is there any particular reasons for choosing that country?
Generally, as you alluded to at the very beginning of our conversation, globally, we have a need to restore about 1 trillion trees. So in addition to the 3 trillion trees that currently exist on Earth, we can increase global tree cover by 30%, by 1 trillion. So this already gives you an impression of the scale of the work that's needed. And it also means that on all continents, there are a lot of reforestation, restoration opportunities. So there are a lot of countries in which large-scale reforestation is absolutely needed and would make a lot of sense. But of course, there are some areas in the world that are higher priorities than others. And this, of course, includes the tropics to a large extent because tropical forests grow a lot faster than forests in the global north, and as a result, capture a lot more carbon. Some forests are also more important than others because of the biodiversity. In addition to capturing carbon, we also want to protect and conserve local biodiversity. That's another reason for being here. But there were obviously also some practical reasons why we initially built up our work here in Mexico, with a very strong base of Young Plant for the Planet supporters here in Mexico that made it possible for us to set up this project here. But it by no way means that Mexico is the only important country to restore forests, and there's so many places around the world where that's necessary. But to a large extent, the impact is biggest in the countries of the global south and around the tropics, not just for these ecological reasons, of course, but also because reforestation leads to a lot of employment. And of course, we have the biggest social benefit in creating these jobs in countries where they're needed most.
So you're mentioning quite a few benefits of reforestation and of the projects that you're carrying out. What is your main aim? What do you want to achieve by planting millions of trees each year?
The main aim is helping us address the climate crisis by removing huge amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. But of course, as I alluded to, this is not the only benefit of restoring forests. We also have the social benefits and also the biodiversity factors and so on.
Can you give us a quick school lesson? How do forests actually help us to mitigate climate change?
It was really quite simple. I think most people learned about photosynthesis in about 6th grade. Trees through photosynthesis absorb CO2 and then split this CO2 in carbon and oxygen. Oxygen is then released again, and the carbon is incredibly important for all plants, of course, as a sort of construction material. So in effect, most of this carbon is then stored in the tree's trunk, and some of the carbon is also, in the long run, deposited in the soil around the tree. So this essentially means that the tree itself acts as a carbon sponge, and the soil does so as well. So as the biomass on a piece of land increases, the amount of carbon stored there increases.
So that's a very simple and natural solution to tackle climate change. But on the other hand, reading the news in the past few weeks, forest fires have been everywhere in the headlines. So these fires might destroy the work of years in a few days. How do you deal with that? What are you thinking about it? Is reforestation still a reasonable option?
Of course, when we do reforest here, we put a lot of effort into making sure that these forests are as resistant as possible to forest fires. But of course, that's not entirely preventable. It's absolutely tragic to see how much forest is destroyed every year as a result of these fires.
So when a forest or a tree burns down, all of the carbon that is actually stored gets released. But trees do not necessarily have to burn down to die. So can you give us another school lesson? What happens when trees rot? Isn't all the CO2 released as well?
From that carbon that tree captures, part of it is in the tree itself, and part of it is deposited in the soil. Now, when this tree either, burns down in your example or decomposes, the carbon that's in the biomass, that's in the above ground part of the tree, is then generally released again. So if you look at the level of an individual tree is like a temporary carbon storage unit for maybe 100 years. But of course, we're not planting individual trees, but rather we're restoring forests. And once an area has become an intact forest, when an individual tree dies, a new tree seeded from one of the nearby trees takes its place. And then essentially this new tree reabsorbs the carbon released by the passing tree. So in the long run, if you look at it at the level of the forest, it's like a constant carbon capture. And it takes quite a while for forests to reach their maximum carbon capture potential. So in the roughly first 100 years, the amount of carbon a forest stores increases every year. But I mean, what's also incredibly important, and I don't get tired of saying this in every conversation, is that trees alone are, of course, not the solution to the climate crisis. And they certainly cannot be. We can only tackle the climate crisis if at the same time we drastically reduce global carbon emissions. And on top of that, restore as much forest as possible.
Speaking of that kind of basic knowledge and things we all should know, there are two scientific terms which are used more and more often these days. They are climate neutrality and climate justice. We at Greiner, we want to be climate neutral by 2030. And as you said before, that doesn't mean to offset all your emissions. So let's say to plant trees and just continue business as usual. That means to actually reduce your emissions. And of course, if some emissions remain, then you can offset or compensate. But could you briefly explain for us what is climate neutrality and what is climate justice actually?
I think, as you explained quite well, climate neutrality means that your net emissions are zero. You reduce your emissions as much as possible, and the emissions that you cannot avoid, you compensate. We have a very clear rule at Plant for the Planet when we speak to companies, in that we make clear that people shouldn't be using nature to offset their carbon emissions, but restoring nature is an extra bonus on top. So we encourage all companies, reduce your emissions as much as possible. And this is obviously what I think Greiner should be doing. Reduce your emissions as much as possible. The emissions that you cannot immediately avoid, you compensate. And on top of that, compensate an equal amount again in forests. So in a way, you are essentially double climate neutral by compensating your emissions and then again capturing an equal amount of emissions from the atmosphere through trees. Climate justice is an even more complicated concept, and it essentially relies on a very simple idea, though, which is that the countries of the global south, the people that are already poorest today, who often contributed the least to causing the climate crisis, right? Because the vast majority of emissions were caused by people of the global north, by the rich part of the world. But nonetheless, the poor part of the world will be hit most by the consequences. Simple example is floodings and hurricanes, for instance. Whereas the rich part of the world can very easily afford to to some extent adapt to these consequences by building dams and so on. Other parts of the world cannot afford these kinds of technologies to some extent mitigate the consequences of the climate crisis.
In November 2011, the United Nations Environmental Programme handed over the so-called Billion Tree campaign to your organization to plant for the planet. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, around the same time we launched our project Plant for the Planet, the UN Environmental Programme started this project they called the Billion Tree Campaign, where they called on the world to plant 1 billion trees. And after vastly exceeding their initial goal in 2011, they handed over this campaign to us children at Plant for the Planet, to continue leading this work. This was a real challenge for us because we'd gotten this big responsibility. So we really asked ourselves, where do we take this from here? What is our next target? And in that process, we asked a couple of ecologists and climate scientists in trying to understand how much forest there is in the world and how many additional trees we could restore. And we thought that these were super simple questions, but soon realized that nobody had any real answers for us. Nobody could answer these questions directly until we found a team of 3 great scientists at Yale University back then that started a 3-year research project for us. And then they published their results in the journal Nature, where they concluded that globally we have roughly 3 trillion trees. And then in a second paper, they concluded that we could restore up to 1 trillion trees in addition.
That's 1,000 billion trees, a number that is quite hard to imagine. And what is the current status of this incredible journey, and how can each one of us contribute?
Well, the best thing that anyone can do is support a reforestation project anywhere around the world. And to make this as easy as possible for anyone, we developed the Plant for the Planet app, which is really quite a simple idea. You download the app or you visit it at pp.eco. PP as Plant for the Planet, pp.eco. And what it does is it shows you great reforestation projects all around the world. And for each reforestation project, shows you where exactly they plant, how the sites that they're planting on are changing over time, of course, which species they plant, what survival rate they have, and so on. And very importantly as well, the costs per tree. And then you select your favorite project and you donate directly to them. And what's really important is that 100% of the donations to this app go directly to the project. We don't keep any of the money anywhere.
So please, everyone, get online and download the app in order to support Felix and Plant for the Planet. Since 2018, Greiner plants 1 tree for each employee each year through Plant for the Planet. That is not related to our goal of becoming climate neutral, but still it is around 11,000 trees per year. Felix, can you give us an update? How are the trees? Where are they growing and how many hectares of trees is that?
Yeah, that's quite a number. 11,000 trees is about 10 hectares of forest, a bit more than that. And they're growing just a few kilometers from where I'm sitting right now. And should any one of your colleagues ever be here in southern Mexico, you're always invited to take a look and we'd be happy to show you your trees. Of course, we don't want to encourage anyone to fly all the way from Europe to Mexico just to look at some trees. But if you're here anyway, then we're very happy to show you around.
That's great to know. And of course, flying over from Europe to Mexico could kind of harm the good impact we have made. And speaking of impact, that reminds me of a conversation that I recently had with young apprentices here at the Greiner campus in Upper Austria. They started an intense discussion around whether one person can really make a difference. And I thought that discussion was very inspiring to hear. Felix, what is your take? What difference can one person make?
Yeah, I do see how this is a very interesting and difficult question to answer. On the one hand, I absolutely agree with the general idea that blaming the climate crisis on individuals and a lot of discourse, especially in the early 2000s, where we were telling everyone to, fly less, take the train more, and so on, was misguided in that it failed to show how massive a transformation we needed globally to have any realistic chance of tackling the climate crisis. We're not going to solve this crisis by a few people taking the train more and eating less meat. We can only do this through fundamental changes to our economies and large-scale action by large corporations. But at the same time, people have a lot of influence in the companies they work at, to influence them, have a lot of influence as voters, and by setting that example of eating less meat, taking the train, in a way, encouraging others to take this crisis more seriously. People can be quite powerful that way. And I think the Fridays for Future movement is the best example that an effectively small group of students who are certainly not considered some of the most powerful actors in our society, have been able to dominate our public conversation in many European countries for about a year, and to some extent managed to move some governments to more serious climate action, is a great example about how small minorities in society can have quite a big impact.
And I think encouraging people, that's a very good keyword. Also, what you are doing is a great example of what difference one person can make. So for my very last question, I would like to ask you, we at Greiner, we have a sustainability strategy in place, which is called Blue Plan. We want to become climate neutral by 2030. We want to be a fully circular business by 2030. And as you can imagine, that kind of transformation process comes with a lot of challenges and with a lot of obstacles. I'm very sure that for you as well, as founder of a nonprofit organization, you had to face many challenges and obstacles, and you have to face them day by day. Can you give us some of your key learnings for how can we bring that change about? What have you learned in your 13 years at Plant for the Planet?
Wow, I'm not sure I can be that valuable. I don't consider myself, even though it's a main part of my job, a particularly good manager. And of course, that's a major part of the work that's needed there. I really appreciate the ambition that Greiner has in its 2030 plan. I think my biggest wish in this process is that when we talk about climate neutrality, it kind of generally gives the reduction and the compensation equal weight. Right? Reduction and compensation can both contribute towards achieving that net zero. But of course, in reality, compensation is never as good as actual reduction. So I really hope as much as possible of that road to net zero is actual reduction and not compensation. Of course, I understand that by 2030, achieving 100% reduction is close to impossible. But I hope you get as close as possible.
So reduction instead of compensation, that's a very good note to end our conversation. But before we finish the interview, I would like to invite you to a little word rap. I will tell you one word and you answer with whatever comes to your mind. Is that okay with you?
Sure, okay.
Okay, here we go. First term, planting trees.
Planting trees is just one way to restore forests. A lot of forests around the world can actually come back through other strategies that often cause a lot less work, like natural regeneration. So if we want to restore 1 trillion trees, we only in the most extreme cases do we have to plant them all. In a lot of areas, by just allowing forests to naturally regenerate, we can achieve a lot more forest cover. So tree planting is only one of many strategies there.
Next term, deforestation.
One of the saddest aspects of our work, it's incredibly tragic to see how in Brazil, particularly after a decade of wonderful progress between 2004 and roughly 2014, where deforestation was reduced by about 70%, two consecutive governments, the Temer and now the Bolsonaro government, are undoing all the wonderful progress that had been made. But I think these 10 years in Brazil are a wonderful example to see that solving this problem is absolutely possible.
Being less serious, tacos.
Tacos are one of my favorite foods in the world, and one of the best parts about my job or my role here at Plant for the Planet is how much time I get to spend in Mexico.
I'm glad to hear that. And last but not least, one message to the world.
Restoring as much of the world's forest as possible, which is about 1 trillion trees, is one of the most beautiful and powerful things we can do to not only tackle the climate crisis, but at the same time improve our world in so many other beautiful and meaningful ways.
That's a very encouraging and hopeful note to end on. Thank you so much, Felix. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Well, it was wonderful to speak to you. Thank you.
So have a great day in Mexico or wherever you are, and make sure to subscribe to Greiner Talks. And thank you for listening.
Greiner Talks, a Greiner podcast. Subscribe now.